There are a number of ways and reasons why you might want to develop mathematical models for health and for epidemiology. And I would say the first one is to inform and support policy making and implementation in health. And by that I mean if you have a particular disease that's spreading in a population and there is a limited budget and there are limited resources to decide what to do about it, then how can we best use the resources of the country to deliver a strategy that will reduce the harm as much as possible? So that's one way in which mathematical models can be useful. And the reason why they're useful is because we run a simulated version of what's happening in real life, the real epidemic. We run a simulated version of that, and we run it many, many times to cover all of the things that we might not know about that epidemic at the very beginning, and also to cover all of the potential strategies that might be deployed to control it. So we run it maybe thousands of times, and then you're able to choose from those many scenarios that we simulate which one is likely to have the best impact. Mathematical models, there are many different varieties of mathematical models. The simplest ones are made from a set of a few differential equations are designed to talk about the way that things change with time and with each other. So if you can describe a system by the elements of that system and how they change with time and with each other, then you can write the equations to go with that system, and that is your mathematical model. There are other types. Another type of mathematical model is called an agent-based model or an individual-based model. And for those, they're more like a computer simulation where you create a synthetic population of people, and those people, you can give them characteristics like real people in a population, and you can use data from the population you're interested in, the way that households are set up, the way that people move, where they live, how old they are, where they're going to school, how they mix with each other. And you can put all of that into a simulation where you generate this synthetic population to compare with the real population, and then you simulate the disease spreading through that population in the same way that it would in reality. So those models are also very nice and very detailed, but they are more challenging because you need a lot more data to produce them. They take longer to code, they take longer to run. So there is a place for all of those models, that entire spectrum, from the very simple set of differential equations all the way through to a full agent-based model. So the socioeconomic context is very interesting to me because I specialize in models for global health, and for that reason what we see in those settings is quite a range of different socioeconomic settings, and that can manifest in a few ways in terms of the patients and the people who we are simulating the models about and who we hope will benefit from the strategies that we develop using these models. Those people live in very different environments, and that affects their risk of disease. So some people will have a very high risk of disease because of their socioeconomic setting. They will also access treatment and other forms of intervention differently for that reason. So we need to incorporate that into models. Also, on a regional or global level, the resources available to combat those diseases are very different from one country or even one region within a country to another. And that is something else that we must incorporate into mathematical and economic models. So measles is a very interesting issue globally. The reason that measles is an interesting issue globally is the issue of vaccine hesitancy and low coverage of the vaccine. So I'll deal with that question first. What we have seen in Brazil, as in many countries, is a reducing coverage within the population of vaccine protection. It's understandable in some ways because how can you perceive a risk of measles when you do not see any measles? Except the reason that you do not see any measles is because everyone is covered with the vaccine. So it's kind of understandable, but also I think it is imperative for scientists, the public, and the politicians to all work together to make sure that people, and especially children, are protected against measles in the future. And one of the things that could be useful is to give people an understanding of what herd immunity actually means. So for measles, the reason why the vaccine target is so high, you need very, very high, above 90% coverage in order to avoid large numbers of measles cases. The reason for that is something called the basic reproduction number of that disease. And what the basic reproduction number means is the average number of people that, if I were infected, I could infect in a population that was completely susceptible before I recovered. So if the basic reproduction number is 10, then before I recover, I can infect 10 more people. And then those 10 people can infect 10 more people, and so on. And that's why an epidemic rises and increases exponentially in the beginning. So in order to prevent an infected person from infecting other people, 10 other people, then you need to vaccinate at least 9 of them, right? Because then I would only replace myself with the remaining 1 person. So that is why coverage, if an R0 is 10, the coverage must be 90%. If an R0 is 20, the coverage must be 95%. If the R0 is lower, the coverage does not need to be so high to control a disease. So I think if we were able to explain that concept in simple terms to many people, perhaps this would help. Defining being free of a disease in a country is quite a challenge when the disease is still in other countries, because of course you get imported cases. It would be impossible to be completely free of measles if it was transmitting anywhere else around the world, even if your vaccination program was excellent and had the right coverage. So the definitions to define being measles free talk about onwards transmission, and there are definitions that can be found on the WHO website for various diseases, including measles, that have been chosen to define that cutoff of when a country is measles free, and it involves no onward transmission for a particular length of time. And the reason why you can have cases if you're declared measles free are for 2 reasons. One is that you have some imported cases, which is not a big issue. The other one is that transmission has started again because of this decline in vaccination coverage, and if person-to-person transmission is occurring in the country, then I think there's a possibility that there will be a review of the measles-free status based on those definitions.